If I were to ask you to name a Greek philosopher, you would likely say Plato or Aristotle, and that would be perfectly justified, as these two did influence European philosophy for the better part of 2 millennia. They are not the topic of this video though. Rather, I would like to take a look at who came before them and where they took their influences from. In particular, this video is about the first Greek philosophers, at least those which we know of. To begin, we need to travel not to Athens, but a city called Miletus in Ionia, a Greek colony located on the western coast of Anatolia, as well as some 2,500 years back in time. There we can meet Thales, and with him the beginnings of Greek philosophy, which at that time was mainly Greek cosmology. Before we take a look at Thales' theories, I must warn you that they may not seem very philosophical at first. It's important to keep in mind that over the course of more than 2,000 years, the definition of philosophy has changed quite a bit, and philosophy used to deal with a much broader arrangement of topics. Disciplines like physics or biology used to be called natural philosophy, for example. That being said, Thales is neither a modern scientist nor a modern philosopher, but rather an ancient scholar, and we should treat him as such. So what did Thales think about the world? Unfortunately, we do not know a lot about Thales and what he thought, but we do know that his opinion was that water was really important. In fact, he claimed that all things come from water. Additionally, he thought that the Earth was more like a disc and less like a sphere, and rested on top of water like a piece of wood, which honestly doesn't seem unintuitive for a person living on the coast some 2,500 years ago. There's one other thing we know about Thales, and it's his investigation of movement. He seemed to pose a very interesting question: why do things move? And for him, it seemed that it was the soul which was some kind of moving principle, and it's from there he goes on to say that magnets have got souls, because they move. I don't know about you, but I find that idea quite endearing. Thales doesn't stop at just magnets though. It seems that he might have thought that everything had a soul, as the soul seemed to be associated with the divine, and one of the things ascribed to Thales was the sentence, "Everything is full of gods." And that is more or less what we know about Thales. And it might not seem that impressive, but allow me to defend him, because I feel like he did something very important, not necessarily in what he thought, but in how he thought. In a time and place where polytheism was used to explain the world, Thales did something that would set the stage for thousands of years to come. Instead of using multiple gods to explain many things, he explained many things using just water. So for one, he went from needing multiple things to explain the world to just needing one, and he also went from the classical gods to water, a recognizable element of nature. His theories also were developed from arguments and not taken from myth. Although we can't exactly reconstruct them, one of them might have gone something like, what can move has got a soul. What has got a soul is divine. Everything can move, and therefore everything is divine or full of gods. Admittedly, saying that everything can move seems a bit weird, but if we were to say, drop a stone, we might count it falling as it moving. So, in my opinion, we have got much more than just weird theories here, and we can see the beginning of a quote-unquote rational thinking grounded in arguments. With that being said, let's move on to Thales' successor, Anaximander. While Thales thought of the earth as flat and resting on water, Anaximander did one better than that and said that the earth is in fact drum-shaped and doesn't rest on anything. Ignoring the fact that he said the earth looks like a drum, the argument Anaximander gave for saying that the earth doesn't need any support is extremely important, and goes like this. The earth remains in position because it does not have a sufficient reason to move one way rather than another. This might not seem mind-blowing, and for humans living today it very much isn't, but as far as I'm aware, Anaximander was the first to introduce the so-called principle of sufficient reason, which would go on to be quite important in the history of philosophy. This alone would qualify Anaximander as one of the creators of irrational science. But his contributions don't stop there, and we know much more about his idea of the cosmos than that of Thales. Whereas Thales had water as his starting point, Anaximander had something a bit more abstract called the boundless, or apeiron in Greek. The boundless was an eternal and eternally moving, qualitatively and quantitatively indefinite primary stuff, which went through different stages in order to create our universe. The story goes something like this. At first, a finite germ was separated from the boundless, and that germ apparently produced hot and cold, which somehow just were already contained in it. Moving on to the second stage. The hot and cold are separated, the hot seeming to be a flame and the cold seeming to be moisture. As they are separated, the flame grows into a fiery bark around the moist center, a part of which dries up and becomes earth. During the third and final stage, the entire thing blows up, as it seems that hot and cold just really don't like each other. This explosion bursts open the fiery bark and its contents are shot outwards, where fiery rings are now being formed. Alongside the fire, some moisture or mist is shot along and covers these rings of fire, only leaving some holes open where fire might shine out. Now you might be incredibly confused about this whole ordeal, but these holes where fire shines out are Anaximander's explanation for what the heavenly bodies are. He even accounts for the phases of the moon by saying that these holes can change how open or closed they are, so more or less light will be visible in the sky. And if you thought this story was wacky, there's more. After Earth was created and while it's drying, living creatures start to come into the picture. How, you might ask? By being spontaneously generated from slime or mud, of course. Fish-like creatures with a thorny bark are born in the wet parts of our planet and eventually move on to live on land, where their barks break off. Humans, we are told, also started out as fish, or rather, as inside of fish. Human infants are quite famous for dying very easily, so Anaximander thought the first humans could not have survived in that state. Instead, the first humans started out as fetuses inside of large fish, and once they were strong enough, only then they emerged from the safety of the fish. And again, from a modern point of view, this seems utterly insane, but I can't help but love it. And as insane as it might seem, I think we have to give him credit for having a biological model of how things came to be, though admittedly it is quite rudimentary. And just like with Thales, if we manage to look behind what at first might seem just like ancient people having ancient weird ideas about the world, we can see the beginnings of a new kind of thinking. I would like to showcase one more philosopher, and it might get slightly confusing because we are moving from Anaximander to Anaximenes. Anaximenes is interesting because he combines ideas from Thales and Anaximander. Just like Thales, he's got a basic element, but instead of water, it's air. And just like Anaximander's boundless, Anaximenes' air is one and is infinite and is also divine. What's interesting about Anaximenes' air is that it changes depending on its density. Being made finer, it becomes fire. Being made thicker, it becomes wind, then cloud, then water, then earth, then stone, and from these everything else is made. Another interesting point about this is that unlike Thales, who said that merely everything comes from water, Anaximenes said that everything comes from air and actually still is air. And now you might ask, well, if everything's air, then how are things different? The answer to this is an, in my opinion, incredibly important thought by Anaximenes. That is that qualitative differences can be reduced to quantitative factors. As we have seen, he said that air takes different forms depending on its density, and not just its form changes, but the very quality of a thing. Just like the quality of a chess game changes drastically depending on if you're playing alone or with an opponent. Now, you might not be convinced that air actually changes form, but I do like the way Anaximenes argues for it, and it's something you can try at home. Your breath is chilled when you compress it with your lips, and warm when you loosen your mouth. I think that argument's quite neat. Now, just like his predecessors, Anaximenes had his opinion about how our universe works. In his version, everything revolves unsurprisingly around air. The earth rides on air like a leaf floating in the wind, and so do the heavenly bodies, which turn thanks to air. And instead of them being rings of fire, Anaximenes describes the heavenly bodies more like a felt cap sitting on top of earth, which is kinda cute. I have now told you about 3 of the earliest philosophers, and while their theories are fun and interesting, what really draws me to them is their way of thinking. As I hopefully was able to show you, we can see the roots of a new way of thinking develop in these early thinkers, and while their theories might seem ridiculous from our perspective today, I really do admire them and think given their circumstances, they gave some very creative answers to the problems they sought to solve. That being said, I hope you were able to learn something from this video, and if I have awoken your interest in these thinkers, you can find the books I used for this video in the description, and do feel free to read up on them for yourself. Thank you for watching.